Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Joy Alice Eisenhower, and this program, I want to welcome you all to our program on renewable energy in Israel. And I want to let you know that this is a collaboration with the Boulder JCC, Jewish Colorado, and the Jewish Agency. We will begin the presentation with everybody on mute, but there'll be plenty of opportunity for people to unmute and engage in questions and dialogue throughout the presentation. And after our presentation, I'd like to let you all know that our maven for arts and culture, Barbara Traeger, and I will stay on if anybody wants to say hi or have any additional questions. And while we still might have some people joining the call, I want to respect everyone's time and welcome our presentation, our presenter today, our Israel emissary, Itai Davinsky. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Joy. Hello, everyone. And I'm not sure what you say when it's noon. It's not good morning. Maybe it's not afternoon. It's noon. So I guess good noon to everyone. And a few seconds of background before we start. So obviously, when I speak with our community in Boulder, in Denver, in Colorado in general, I am speaking about Israel in many, many different aspects, which I am not an expert on. And this is one of them. I have personal interest in this and knowledge, but I am not an interest. So really my hope for today is to be able to give you an idea of what the whole notion of, or the whole idea of renewable energy looks like in Israel, and where it is today, where it has been, where it is today, where it's heading, and maybe inspire you to go in and find more information. And I'm sure that there will be many questions you have that I don't have answers to, because as I said, I'm not an expert, and maybe even some of you here can share answers about questions that I don't know, because really this is a subject that I think is interesting to many people around the world, and specifically in the United States and in Colorado even more specifically. So what I'm saying is that we are here to learn, and there is a lot of information out there, and I hope we are inspired to go and learn more about it. And if there's anyone who has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in there. I always say this, when you ask questions, it gives me an opportunity to get some air. So please feel free to do that. I'd rather you interrupt me with your voice and not necessarily the chat. So feel free to just jump in there, unmute yourself as we go. So I think we're good to start. And I always start with, I usually start with this slide. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Itai, and I am the Senior Community Shaliach at Jewish Colorado. And the Shlichim program is a program of the Jewish Agency, which has literally hundreds of Israel emissaries working in Jewish communities all around the world. And some of them are senior community Shlichim like me. Others are Shinshinim, they're teen emissaries like we have here in Colorado every year, 4 Israelis on a gap year between high school and their service. They come here and do a year of volunteer work with the Jewish community. And there are many other types of shlichim. And this is a program of the Jewish Agency where local communities, in our case, the Federation, Jewish Colorado, takes upon itself the responsibility of raising all the money and finding a house for me and my family and everything that entails. And you can see in the picture, this is my family. We've been here since August with my wife, Mor, and our 3 daughters. And we come from an area in southern Israel called Ramat HaNegev, which Jewish Colorado, and actually the Jewish community in Colorado in general, has had a very warm, over 20-year-old partnership with. And Boulder just became, 2 years ago, a sister city with Ramat HaNegev. So many, many connections exist. And actually what brought me to be emissary here in Colorado was one of those connections. Every year there is a young leadership mission that comes from Ramat Negev for a week-long visit in Colorado to learn about the Jewish community, to learn about Jewish life, and to learn about Colorado in general. And on 2016, I had the great pleasure of being on one of those missions that Jewish Colorado hosts, and that's how I got to learn. I got to know Osnat, which was the previous shlicha, and to learn about the Jewish community here. Obviously, as you can see, I was inspired enough by everything going on here to schlep my family across the ocean and move here. So we've been here since August, and we are here. And we're planned to be here for 3 years before going back to Ramat Negev. And now we'll start the conversation about renewable energy in Israel. And I think I'll start by saying that obviously every area in the world has its challenges and opportunities and its local special aspect or context. But this is a very international field, renewable energy. It's not specific to Israel. Israel has some specific things about it, but a lot of this is, a lot of what we'll be talking about is actually things that are going on throughout the world, but we'll try to always find the local context, which will also give us some more understanding of Israel than we just see in the news or on Netflix, which is where many of us are exposed to Israel these days. So these are all pictures from Israel of things that we will be talking about. And we'll start with some background. So the composition of energy sources today in Israel, as you can see, is a lot of oil, a lot of natural gas, not a lot of renewable, and some coal. Now, if you would have looked at this same chart a few years ago, I'm not talking 20 or 30 years ago, much less than that, 5 or 10 years ago, the coal part would be much bigger than the gas. And the reason for that is that Israel has found offshore, very big deposits of offshore natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, which obviously allows it to not only stop importing, but actually today Israel is an exporter of natural gas. And it exports to Egypt, it exports to Jordan, it exports to the Palestinians. And you can imagine that this really creates opportunities for cooperation with countries that although we have a peace with, which is an amazing thing, but many times it's a cold peace. And this really, finding that natural gas really created new areas of, possible areas of cooperation. On a side note that is not really related to our topic today, but is interesting, Israel has very good relations with Cyprus and Greece. And one of the things that were being discussed was a gas pipe, a natural gas a pipe that would take the natural gas found in the Eastern Mediterranean off Israel's shores, and through the Mediterranean to Cyprus and then to Greece, and from there it could go to Europe. And that is something that Erdogan, leader of Turkey, did not like. And if you heard on the news about Erdogan drawing up new borders in the Mediterranean, the Turkish sovereign waters in the Mediterranean, south of Turkey, if you heard about Erdogan making changes in that and signing new agreements with North African leaders, then now maybe you have a better understanding of the context of what you heard about Turkey making changes to the borders of its sovereign waters in the Mediterranean. This is most of the context that gas in Israel. Now, finding natural gas is a great thing for Israel. First of all, obviously, economically, it's a great thing, but also when you look at the air quality, so we moved from coal, which is a very, very polluting energy source, to natural gas, which is much cleaner. And today, a majority of the electricity in Israel is produced with natural gas and not with coal anymore. And that is a great thing. But in the context of our conversation of renewables, we know one thing that is right around the world. The more expensive energy, traditional energy, fossil fuel energy is, the more likely it is that we'll see quick and large developments in the renewable sector. And when the energy is not expensive, the renewable sector slows down because obviously that's what it's competing with the fossil fuels. So the natural gas really reduces air pollution by by a great degree. But on the other hand, some would say that it's also slowing down the potential, the incentive to develop the renewable sources. But we'll see now that it seems like the Israeli government is still committed to going in the renewable direction, and even though finding so much natural gas. Again, I'll remind you, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in there. So this is the composition of our energy sources used only to produce electricity. One thing I didn't mention here, the oil part of this is not used to produce electricity almost completely in the last few decades. It has been coal, and from coal it went to gas. So the oil is, like in most of the world, a lot for the transportation sector, where electric cars in Israel have not yet become as prevalent as they are here. I know when I go to downtown Denver or Boulder, in the park, there are parking spaces specifically for electric cars, so they can be charged while they're parking. In Israel, that is starting to show up, but really just starting to, and only in Tel Aviv. So it's we're not quite there yet. There was a very big try by an Israeli entrepreneur to start an electric cars company in Israel, which relied not so much on charging, but actually on changing the battery throughout the day. It was called Better Place. I wouldn't be able to go into the details on why, but that actually failed at the end of the day. That company does not exist anymore.
Itai, quick question.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Right. The 3% renewables, does that include the rooftop hot water heaters that you see all around the country?
That's a great question, and I have tried to find the specific information about that. To the best of my ability to understand the official reports, it does include that, and I will be speaking about the rooftop heaters. The issue with renewables, if you look at the amount of electricity that is produced in solar power in Israel, it's much more than 3% of Israel's total energy or electricity production. But on the official reports, they use a factor, or they downplay the amount of solar energy produced because it's only during the day. So it doesn't really replace the fossil fuel-based power stations. They still have to keep running because they know that a few hours after into the afternoon, the solar goes down, and that's why a lot of these numbers will seem very low, and the percentage doesn't really add up with the number of megawatts produced. And the reason is that those megawatts we're not yet in the position where the megawatts produced by solar are replacing the megawatts produced by fossil fuels. We actually have a redundancy because we need to keep providing energy throughout the day to all sectors. And it's very low here also because this is out of all energy and not only out of electricity. But we'll see that in electricity is also relatively low, and that is the explanation why. So yeah, we will be talking about the rooftop. It is a big, one of Israel's biggest actually efforts that succeeded. Thanks for bringing that up, Peter. And this is only for producing energy, for electricity. The other one was energy in general, and this is for producing electricity. And you can see that we went down from being over 30% coal, more than half coal, to today we have around a quarter coal, and it's still going more and more down. And what is actually going up is the light blue, which is the natural gas. The renewables, as you can see, are that little yellow rectangle is growing, but it's growing very slowly, and it's still, I don't know if to say negligible, but it's still very, very small when you compare it to all the other sources. Now, in international comparison on the use of renewable energies puts Israel at a not very flattering place with 3.2%. Now, there is something in this graph that we have to remember. When you see the blue rectangle is the part of the renewable energy in that country that is produced by hydroelectric energy, and the orange is the rest of the other renewable sources. And what you can see, for example, take Norway as an extreme example. Over almost 70% of their electricity, energy comes from renewable sources, mainly hydroelectric. Now, Israel does, obviously, being a Mediterranean, semi-arid and arid country, does not have that privilege of using hydroelectric to produce renewable energy. And as you can see, most countries that are very high have actually a big part of that is thanks to hydroelectric. So that is one excuse for Israel. But on the other hand, the potential to the solar potential of Israel, and the solar potential basically is an equation that energy planners calculate for a country or for a region, which basically takes into account the radiation in that area because it's solar, which is influenced by dust in the air, it's influenced by clouds and other clouds mainly, but other factors as well play into this. So Israel has the highest solar potential of all the OECD countries, all the developed countries, but it has the lowest rate of use of solar energy. So if we took the hydroelectric excuse to our advantage as Israelis, it's not so much a good excuse because really we could be doing much, much better in terms of solar energy. Demand in Israel. So
Hi, Itai. May I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
You may answer this later, but I wanted to ask if indeed Israel has the highest potential in the OPEC, you said?
In solar.
Yeah. Then why aren't they using it? Why aren't they capitalizing on that potential?
That is a great question. And one of the reasons I think would be more than anything else, bureaucracy. And especially when you're looking at systems that are installed on the ground, which means they're not secondary land use, but they're the primary land use, then the zoning processes in Israel are very, very difficult, especially for large infrastructure projects. And I'll go into a bit of an example of that further in our presentation, but that would be one of the major reasons. And other than that, really, I don't have any good answers. There aren't any good answers, but Israel has started taking some serious steps in that direction in the last few years. And I will be talking about this month. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, the government comes out with a plan to get the public's opinion on the plan before adopting it officially. And that plan talks about a very, very, very big step in this direction. With spoiler, the plan talks about putting Israel at #1 in the world use of solar power in 10 years by 2030.
Wow, that's a big
where
split.
30% of Israel's electricity would be produced solar. So that's a plan that they're talking about now. The previous goals we'll see are much more modest, but there isn't any very good excuse, I would say, at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you.
So the demand is Israel's population. Obviously, demand for energy consists of population growth and also standard of living. The higher the standard of living, better the more energy is consumed. And what this graph shows, the rectangles we're looking at, is the demand for electricity, which obviously is growing and is predicted to keep growing. And if you look at the peak demand of energy in Israel is always in the summer, in hotter days, and not necessarily in the colder winter nights. And if you look at global warming trends, then you understand that this is only going to get worse and worse on that side. Now, Israel's population growth is by far the one of the largest ones in the world and the largest one in the developed world. So we have a high standard of living, we have a high population growth, and we have populations in Israel that have a very low standard of living, almost similar to underdeveloped countries or developing countries, which are also predicted to, the standard of living of those populations is likely to start growing faster, which means, again, more and more energy. To give an example that we can all relate to, there are between tens of thousands or over 100,000 Bedouins living in the Negev, outside of the 6 big Bedouin towns or cities. And most of those lived in areas where they do not have access to the electrical grid. Not all of them, but many of them, which means that they probably would not use an air conditioner, and they might only use the refrigerator during the day and turn it off at night because they use solar panels and all kinds of, well, their standard of living is very low. And once those communities start going through a process that we hope is already starting, and we hope will continue and only get faster, and their standard of living will start going up and up and up, that means that also will create a lot of demand together with population growth. So the whole point of this part was to show you that the demand is growing, and it's actually predicted to keep growing more and more as time goes by. You know, you can look at the Bedouin population in the Negev, you can look at Haredis, and you can also look at the PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, which also gets its electricity from the Israeli electric company. So again, it also, the higher standard of living there also plays into the picture we're trying to draw here.
Hey, Ty, can I ask another question, please? On that last.
Go ahead.
Here, it seems like this graph was maybe done in 2018, because I don't know, it's predicting 2019, 2020. So if I'm reading this right, it predicted that the demand is exceeding the supply, or at least that's what they think would happen. So if that's correct, where are we standing in 2020, and is that trend continuing? What's that going to do for Israel's power demand?
That's a good question. I didn't talk about the lines in the graph. The bars represent demand. The lines do not represent supply. They represent the percentage above supply which is produced. So that's actually, they represent the surplus. So seeing the surplus go down, on the one hand, obviously you're closer to being on the edge, but on the other hand, there's less waste. So that could be a bad thing, it could be a good thing. But they represent the...
So for example, like 2020, there's 28% surplus predicted for this year.
Above the highest demand expected. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the red line is including renewables, and the pink line is not including renewables. That's the difference between them.
Got it.
And I'll also talk about why Israel has always had such a big energy surplus. I'll talk about that when we talk about the opportunities and challenges in a few minutes. Electricity production per capita, and I just talked about the standard of living, and we see that our electricity production per capita is not that high. And this just means that as the standard of living goes up and up and up, and especially with populations that have much lower standard of living than average, and hopefully we're going to see them move fast forward with the standard of living improvement, hopefully, then we should also expect to see this number also going up. Again, we should, at least the demand, and then obviously the production as well, will have to go up to meet the higher and higher standard of living. Now, when we think of electricity or energy, we always think of production, but actually production is not the whole story, and distribution is also very important. And here's a big difference than I think, than what, if I'm not mistaken, is the reality in America. 100% of distribution network is owned by the Israel Electric Corporation, which is almost 100% owned by the Israeli government. So the Israel Electric Company is a government-owned company which produces, it used to produce almost virtually all the electricity. Today we have more and more private producers, but still, as you can see, 75% of production is still done by the Israeli Electric Corporation, and all the distribution is done by them. Now, this obviously, we're not going to go into the whole economic philosophy discussion, but on our very, very narrow look of the renewables, this really creates a, I would say, easy to operate situation for the government, because at the end of the day, the government decides everything. If the government decides it wants to shift from coal to gas, it simply has to, tell the electric corporation to do so and obviously pay for it. And if they want to, to close down a power plant, then they can decide to do so. Obviously, taking into consideration everything that has to be taken in order to provide the energy the country needs. But at the end of the day, the decisions are really in the hand of government. Whereas in a decentralized energy production system, like, if I'm not mistaken, is more what we have here in America, then the government would really have to try to use either subsidies or all kinds of other incentives or permits to get the free market to go in that direction. For the Israeli government, this is much easier, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work within the free market. It does. That's especially true when we're looking at moving to renewables and newer things. But again, it has the very, very strong foundation of 75% of production is owned by the government. Now, the government goals on shift to renewable. This is as part of international agreements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in 2009, and then again in 2015, the Israeli government committed to a 5% renewable goal in 2014, and then a 10% goal in 2020. 5 years after that, 13, and 2030, 17%. And as I told you, a plan that they are now talking about, which is not part of an international agreement. It's something that the Ministry of Energy is pushing for, together with the Ministry of Environmental Protection. They are talking about adjusting the goal and setting a new goal of 30% renewables by 2030. But that has not been yet officially adopted. And this is from the PowerPoint that they used when they announced that new plan that they're talking about. And as you can see, 2019, they're talking about, last year, they're talking about 30%. We have 30% coal and only 5% renewables. And in 2030, 10 years from today, they're aiming for 30% renewables and 70% natural gas. And that's it. We are talking about here about electricity production and not transportation. So again, this is something that is talking about electricity production. but assuming that electric public transportation and electric vehicles, and now the trains in Israel are more and more of the lines are being shifted from using diesel to using electricity for the trains. So we might be seeing a lot of the transportation sector in Israel also start moving towards electricity in the years to come, but that is still an unknown, honestly. Now, a few opportunities and challenges, and then we'll try to go a bit deeper into the different renewable energies that are already being produced in Israel. So opportunities, lots of sun, obviously for solar, we said this is a big opportunity. Israel, under the leadership of Ben Gurion, actually, in the first years, the first decades of Israel, Ben Gurion had research institutions in Israel start researching how to harness the energy of the sun, which made a lot of sense because oil was traditionally controlled by countries that back then were seen as enemies. Today, maybe less, but still many of them are. And a country that has a lot of sun has difficulty exporting and importing energy because it's isolated. It's surrounded by enemy countries in that time, and that's why there was a lot of effort put into into harnessing the solar energy research. And actually, some of the earliest developments of these technologies came from Israel. To the best of my understanding, not only from Israel, but many of the advancements did come from Israel in the early years, not even recently. A developed high-tech sector obviously creates opportunities for advancing renewable energies because there is the knowledge and the research facilities and the high-tech and startups that can be the ones to push this. And as I said, a centralized electricity network is also an opportunity because it lets the government really easily control the energy sector. Now, challenges. Israel's area is very, very small. So anything that would demand a lot of area is a problem. Another challenge is that Israel, and this is a term that was set many years ago, is an energetic island. What does that mean? We cannot buy surplus from our neighbors or sell our surplus of electricity to our neighbors. And when we saw that Israel has a very large surplus of energy, part of the reason for that is exactly that we can't buy energy surpluses from our neighbors, and we can't sell it to them in most opportunities. We can't sell it to them either, which obviously creates a reality where Israel always has to produce more than it uses. It always has to maintain that surplus in order to not have power shortages. And historically, excuse my spelling there, historically, until we found the natural gas, we had few natural resources, which again, as I said, pushed Ben Gurion into trying to, and researchers, not just Ben Gurion, trying to find alternative energy sources. And of course, they all look to the sun for that. So, solar energy, approximately 1,400 megawatts in photovoltaic PV technology and another 250 in thermal solar technology, but this is in summer. These figures are in summer, and obviously during winter, the day is much shorter. And in our climate, the winter time is the cloudier season. So again, the days are shorter and there's more clouds. And obviously that has a great impact on the production of solar energy. So what you see on the top left and top right are two examples of PV. The left, the bigger picture, is a PV power plant that is on the ground, which means that area essentially has been designated, a land use has been designated for energy production. And the example on the right is a gas station where the energy production is a secondary land use, and it's on the roof, and it really does not create any impact on the land use or any impact whatsoever. Obviously, that is the better situation, and it seems like both of these, the ones on the ground, but also the ones on rooftops, are both have been growing the last few years and are planned to keep growing relatively quickly. Now, I said that these are really trends that happen in throughout the world, but one aspect of this that is very Israeli. So there are many who call for the government to really open up all regulation and let everyone install these PV energy producing panels on the rooftops for a reason that has nothing to do with the environment. When a big part of the energy, of the electricity, is produced in a power plant, that means that if our enemies attack that power plant and manage to get through our air defense systems, that could severely impact the electricity production, and potentially affecting hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, of Israelis, for an extended period of time. I mean, if a missile hits the Hadera power station on the Mediterranean coast, in the coastal city of Hadera, that would probably mean that a relatively large area in central Israel would not have electricity at home, literally. And what many are saying is that if we decentralize production of electricity, we really make the risk of one of those infrastructures being attacked much smaller, because electricity is produced everywhere. You can't really fire a missile at everywhere. So that is an Israeli perspective that it doesn't necessarily apply everywhere in the world. You can see one picture with the tower and one with the long U-shaped mirrors. Those are thermosolar electricity production plants. Both of them are in Ramat Negev. They are part of a very big complex which has these two and one PV power station that combinedly produce 250 megawatts. They use thermosolar energy, which means they don't use the energy of the light like PV. They use the heat energy, where mirrors reflect the sun's rays either to a pipe in the center of the U-shaped mirror or to the top of the tower, where there is a big water tank, and that water in the pipe or in the tank becomes steam, and at the bottom there is a turbine which spins and produces electricity. So this is another type. Now, this technology is much older and well-known and reliable, and it has been used around the world. The issue with this technology that in order to create that 250 megawatts, a very large piece of land is really devoted to this as a single land use, because all the mirrors have to be installed, and the cars need to reach to wash the mirrors because there's dust. So this really consumes a lot of land, which is obviously a problem in Israel. So many people feel that this solution is not a good one. Now, I was asked, why don't we have more solar? So just to give you an example, these two plants, they were built in the BOT, Build, Operate, Transfer system, and they're planning, between the beginning of planning and executing, more than 10 years passed. It took more than 10 years. And what happens many times with these big projects is that by the time they reach the finish line and they have all the permits to start building, they're not economic anymore. But the government has already committed to the private companies who are going to build this, and the private companies have already put a lot of capital into these projects. And then really it creates a situation where no one has the incentive to stop this, even though many people feel it's not really the best use of our land or money. And many people see the Ramat Negev Ashalim power plants as an example of that. Obviously, many people are more pragmatic and they say, listen, this is part of the system. we have to move to renewables. And if this is the best we can get, let's get it. And for the future, we'll try to get more PV and less of this. So this is thermosolar. And on the bottom right, you can see a typical roof in an Israeli building, which has a tank of water, which has an electric heater, but not only an electric heater, it also has a solar panel. It's not producing electricity, that panel. It simply has water going through it, getting the sun's rays and getting hot. And throughout most of the year, most Israeli families who have this in their home don't really need to use electricity or gas to heat water for showers. And this is a pretty big part of the solar energy that is captured in Israel. And as you can see, it's around 2/3. So around 2/3 of the energy captured. And this might be a bit lower because the electricity producing panels are being installed every day more and more. So this number is the electricity producing number is growing, but this is the figure I have for now. But this is also something, and really Israel is by far the leader of use of solar energy to heat water for domestic use. And no other country comes even near to the number of these systems that exist in Israel. This is really not an environmental issue for most families. It's simply economic. It's much cheaper to use to get hot water for free, and that's what most Israelis do. Subsidies for PV, either on roofs or on land, were much bigger at the beginning, and as these technologies became prevalent, and as the price of these panels coming from China especially came down, and it became much more economic to install them without any special subsidy, the subsidies have gone almost completely down, but they still exist in some sectors to some degree, but really they're not like they used to be. Now, the way this works in Israel is that everything is owned, all the electricity is owned by the government, as we said. And when someone puts panels on the rooftop, they don't connect that electricity straight to their home. What they do is they sell it to the electric company, and then they buy electricity back from the electric company at a lower price. That's how this becomes economic. So, as I said, there are new plans to make Israel a world leader in solar energy by 2030. And what this new plan basically says is that 10 years from today, the production of electricity from renewable sources will equal all of our electricity production today, which means that we would be doubling our electricity production in 10 years. And all of that doubling would come from solar, from the growth of solar resources. And that is obviously a very big plan, a very ambitious goal. And we'll see, first of all, if this plan will be adopted or not in the coming weeks or months. And if it's adopted, then we'll have to start seeing changes on the ground happening. And this is what the Ministry of Energy presented to the public. It would put Israel at 26%, 26% of all of the energy sources used to create electricity would be solar, where the next country would be 17, Germany 14, etc. So this really, their ambitious plan is meant to put Israel in the forefront of this, and we still have to see if they will succeed or not. A few of the opportunities and challenges. So one of the things that we're seeing in Ramat Negev, that there's energy tourism. The Bright Source power plant with the solar tower is actually the biggest of its kind in the world. There are, maybe you've driven by them in America, a few of these in Arizona, if I'm not mistaken, or California or Arizona. I'm not sure, maybe one of you knows, but this is the biggest of its kind in the world. And what we are seeing in Ramat Negev, that energy tourism is starting to arrive there, which is obviously an opportunity. It's cost efficient, and PV doesn't have to be an exclusive land use. We can use it on the rooftops of other land uses. The downside of solar is that it's only during daytime, and obviously a lot of the consumption is also at night. It's less reliable because of weather. When there is even just half an hour of clouds over a solar power station, the production goes down drastically. It needs lots of area when it's done on the ground and not on rooftops. And many people are now starting to talk about the visual pollution. And as someone who was the secretary of the Ashalim community, which is right in the center of those very big, we used to call them mirror oceans. People came to live in the desert, and they ended up opening their window of their second floor in their home, and instead of looking into the desert, they're looking into a sea of mirrors. And this is something that is obviously starting to also be talked about. By far the biggest renewable energy source is solar. As you can see in this graph, the yellow is solar and the green is the rest of the other renewable sources combined. So really solar is, when we say renewable in Israel, it's all about solar, but we'll still talk about a couple of more options. So one is wind, approximately 30 megawatts. And remember, we were talking about 1,600 megawatts for solar, so you can see the difference. It's produced in 3 farms. There are plans to build more and more of these wind farms, with one that is already under construction in the northern Golan Heights, a 96 megawatt station. So it would be 3 times larger than the combined existing 3 stations are. But it's still very small. And the goal that they're talking about for 2030 is reaching 5% of this. And if you remember with the solar, they were talking about 26%. So this really would bring them to the 30% renewables that they're talking about. The upside of this, that it can work 24 hours a day, doesn't really care about sun. And it's also not an exclusive land use. It can easily be combined with farming, like you can see in the Galilee, in the southern Galilee wind farm, in the picture in the bottom. It can be combined with farming, it can be combined with pasture, it can be combined with different land uses. The downsides of this are noise and visual pollution, and this is something that is talked about throughout the world, not just in Israel, and also an impact on bird populations. And as you may or may not know, Israel is a very, very central migration route for birds between Europe and Africa. So talking about the impact on birds is very central to environmental thought in Israel, especially with the birds. So the oldest one exists since 1992. A few years ago in 2016, 2 more stations were built and are already operational. They're owned by the same company. This is private. It's not owned by the Israel Electric Corporation. And you can see on the map, they're all situated in northern Israel, and that's simply because of the wind potential in those areas. But there's also talk about starting to build wind farms in the Yatir forest, which is actually in southern Israel, in the Yatir area. So that we might be also seeing that happening. Another thing that is actually relatively new, and I don't know if you know this technology, it exists not only in Israel. In Israel, it's relatively new. In other areas, it exists for longer, but pumped storage hydroelectricity. The idea is that 2 reservoirs are built with a substantial height difference between them. And then during the day, when there is high demand for electricity, the water from the upper reservoir is rushed through an underground tunnel, which goes through a power turbine to create electricity. And then at night, when there is a surplus of electricity, the pumps are reversed and the water is pumped back up, only to be let go down the next day. and that this really does not create new energy, because the same energy that is used that is produced from the water going down in the day, that energy is then used to take the water back up at night. But what this does give the managers of the electric system is two things. One is that they can produce electricity at the instant that they want. This can produce 300 megawatts, which is a lot, and it can go into action with 90 seconds. So if, for example, there's a very hot day and they are foreseeing that the peak of demand will be at 2 o'clock, then suddenly at 12 they see that they're starting to get closer to the peak than they thought, they can fire up the fossil fuel stations, power plants, and until those are functional and everything is hot enough to produce electricity, they can use this for half an hour or an hour to provide that time lag until the fossil fuel power plants are operational. So one is that it can give electricity very quickly, and the second is that this also allows for storage of energy. We said that one of the problems with solar energy is that you can produce a lot of it, but you need it at night, and we don't yet have the battery technology to really efficiently store all that energy. And this is essentially a gigantic battery. In many areas around the world, renewable energy is used to pump the excess renewable energy that is produced is used to pump the water up. And then at night, when the solar energy is not functional, they use this to keep producing the energy, the electricity. There are other battery or energy storage technologies. For example, in Ramat Negev, in the U-shaped mirrors power plant, they use melted salt. So 1/3 of the mirrors, instead of creating electricity, they actually heat oil that goes to be stored in the shape of melted salt. And then after sundown, they can keep producing more electricity for a few hours. So there are other storage technologies, but this is one of the biggest ones. And it's very fast, it's very reliable, and it enables energy storage, but it's relatively expensive and its production is limited. Once the upper reservoir is depleted, that's it, you can't produce anymore, and you have to wait until nighttime, pump the water back up. So this is a technology that is relevant to give very specific solutions to very specific problems, but not to the general issue of producing electricity. And you can see on the map, I don't know if any one of you recognizes, but this is on the Gilboa. So the lower reservoir, the one on the bottom, is right by the Gilboa in the Israel or Jezreel Valley, and the upper reservoir is up on the Gilboa Mount. And I don't know if you can see, but to the right of the upper reservoir, there are also wind turbines. So it's the same location. There's wind energy and also the pump storage hydroelectricity. Now, all of these solutions were about production, but there's also a very big effort in Israel on the demand side. So the Israeli government implements different policies aimed at reducing demand in different sectors, in domestic sectors, but also in commerce and agriculture and public services, etc. Basically, I would say, if to generalize, the two major efforts could be summed to: one is creating more transparency and better measuring and billing, so that people know what they're using and know what they're paying for, and hopefully that leads to a reduced wasteful behavior. And there are a lot of regulations about what the energy bill looks like that a family gets, because the legislator really wanted, or the policymakers really wanted, for people to be able to understand what they're using in order to try to push them towards being less wasteful with energy. And another thing is a shift towards more efficient systems and appliances. And this is done mainly by subsidies. So here you have an example on the bottom. It's a residential sector. And when it says that electricity or energy was saved with refrigerators, that literally means that if you had a very old refrigerator, you brought it to a place where they received it, and then you got a 30% subsidy for buying a new refrigerator. And every year they would set, according to the budget they had for this, they would set the number of refrigerators that would be changed according to the budget that they had for this project. And the same went with air conditioners and sun heated boilers and many different other appliances, and also cars, not just electricity. Now this program has been defunded, so it's not working anymore. But for a few years, if you had an old car over 20 or 25 years old, you would bring it in, and it doesn't really matter how much it's worth, you would get 3,000 shekels for it. And the idea was to try to get old cars, which are more pollutant and use more energy off the streets, to again try to push people towards more or less energy intense appliances. But this is also true in not just in the residential sector, but also in the commercial, the public and industrial. And I can give a personal example. As the secretary of a community in Ramat Negev, we got a 30% subsidy from the government for changing all of our street lights in the community from regular lights, which to LED, to LEDs, which obviously consume much less energy. Now, the beauty about that was that the government gave a 30% subsidy for us to do that. And the companies that wanted that work were willing to give us free credit, so that at the end of the day, or almost free credit, at the end of the day, the smaller electricity bills really paid for the new lighting, which were better, more reliable, and longer lifespan, which also meant less spending for local government. So a lot of projects like this to replace street lights, to replace cooling systems and heating systems in industry and all kinds of sectors are implemented. And in the kibbutzim, this is happening, and everywhere. All sectors are trying to get a piece of these subsidies, because at the end of the day, they mean saving money for those businesses or local governments. That was my presentation about renewable energy in Israel, and I tried to give you a glance of where we are, our challenges and opportunities. Solar is really the biggest way forward with renewable energy in Israel, but also taking demand down by either people wasting less or being more efficient when using electricity is also something that is very much being looked at in Israel. And one of the sectors we didn't talk about, which is one of Israel's biggest, I think, problems, is transportation. The public transportation in Israel, well, it's not as bad as Denver, but it's still far from being good enough, which obviously creates a lot of energy waste in that sector. And if there are any questions, I'm glad to try to address them. Desalination is, well, it gives us a lot of water, but it's actually it consumes a lot of energy. The desalination process demands a lot of energy, and that is one of the downsides of desalination, that water in Israel is very expensive. So we have a lot of water, but it's not cheap because we have to desalinate it.
Hey, Itai, I have a question on desalination, maybe unrelated to the topic of non-renewable energy, but I'm very curious. Yeah. I was at the Dead Sea last week with some friends, and just seeing over the years how it just keeps the water level just keeps going down. And I heard that there were plans, or at least one idea about using the runoff from desalination plants as a possible way to refill the Dead Sea. But even that, like the brine from the desalination plants, but even that is not, they don't think that would mix with the Dead Sea waters because the water is so unlike any other water. Is there any current plans to go forward with a plan to save the Dead Sea?
So one of the situation in the Dead Sea is very, very difficult. And just to give you, to try to grasp how severe, how fast the Dead Sea is shrinking, the water level is going down 1 meter, 3 feet every year. And it's not a very big lake. So it's really an issue, a big issue. The only, I would say, half or a quarter realistic plan that has really been put forth is a tunnel that would bring water at the beginning from the Mediterranean. That was one idea, but then that really shifted, and the idea became creating a tunnel that would bring water from the Eilat Bay, from the Red Sea, all the way to the Dead Sea, creating a project that would create energy, that produce energy, that would create opportunities for tourism industry and maybe other industries. And this all would be done in cooperation between the Palestinian Authority, Israel, and Jordan. And there was serious talk about this 10 or 20 years ago. And actually the World Bank had even was on the way to committing funding or partially funding this. So this project was being discussed at the level of funding it even. But since it's really not been on the radar so much, and maybe when in better days, as it relates to the relations between Israel, Jordan, and the PA, maybe this will be back on the table. Ecologists are not very enthusiastic about this plan because no one really knows what that would do. The water composition is so different between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea. No one really knows what this would do. But at the end of the day, the Dead Sea is really drying up. So that is also something that is a big unknown. One interesting thing about the Dead Sea is that naturally this has always been the cycle. So it dries up and then it fills up in more humid eras, and then it dries up again in drier eras.
Well, Itai, thank you so much. I know that you're answered so many of my questions with your thoughtful and clear presentation. And unless we have any other questions, I would like to thank you so much for being here today and for sharing all of this wonderful, inspirational information with us. I know this is dear to our hearts in Colorado and exciting to hear what's going on in Israel.
Yeah, and this also, on the last Young Leadership Mission, we had someone from Ramat Negev who actually started a small business, and his small business is cleaning PV solar panels. He builds small water pipes, and they automatically clean. And once in a while, an employee of his comes and does a better cleaning. And when we came here, we thought that might be an opportunity for cooperation, seeing that there's a lot of solar panels used here. But then we discovered that Colorado doesn't have that much dust like Ramat Negev does. So in Ramat Negev, you have to clean those solar panels very, very frequently, and in Colorado, not so much. So I think this also creates ways for us to cooperate, and we might even see, technology going back and forth and investors. And I really hope that this can create more channels of cooperation between our communities in Ramat Negev and here in Colorado. So thanks a lot for giving me the platform and the opportunity to talk about this. And
thank you very much. It was very interesting.
I'm glad.
Thank you, Itai.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Itai. And again, if anybody would like to stay on the call and just ask any additional community questions and say hi, and Barbara Traeger will be here. And Itai, just having you here as our emissary has built such an amazing connection between Colorado and Israel. We're so grateful for you.
Great. And if anyone is not on my mailing list and would like to be, send me an email and I'll add you to my mailing list where I'll let you know about programs. I think the only program besides our Monday morning updates this month will be a conversation with friends from the Jewish community in former Soviet Union countries to learn about their Jewish communities and COVID-19 and everything that's going on there. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Enjoy. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.